Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Is this working? Yeah, it's working, mashallah. Very good. Very happy to be here, first and foremost. Very happy to see all those lovely faces, it's a very diverse hall. Amsterdam has a lot of Muslims in it and from different places of the world, so I'm very happy to be in your beautiful country, in your beautiful city. Very clean, by the way. You know, yes, it's a very clean city. We're just kind of observing things and good infrastructure, lots of things to talk about. But to delve right into the topic, now I used to work as a teacher, right? And this is how we used to start every lesson with high school kids. We used to have objectives. So I haven't kind of lost that touch, still got that a little bit. These are the objectives for today, right? I've got a laser here. So the first objective is to know the first principles, basic history of liberalism. Number two is to compare Islamic traditionalism, and obviously these are all key words, right? And liberal contractarianism in particular. I'll tell you what that means as well. And number three is to be able to make a judgment based on those comparisons. Now, obviously here, when we're doing a comparative study, we're talking about two things fundamentally. We're talking about similarities and differences. So when we talk about liberalism and Islam or Islamic traditionalism, which we'll come to define, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at not just points of conflict and tension, but we are going to also be looking at points of overlap. And I think that's the healthy approach. Some people, like the brother mentioned, mashallah, very well. I really applaud his approach on this one. Some people have this conversation in a different kind of way, in an apologetic kind of way. You know, and that is because, as he's mentioned, we're minority groups in this country. So we're asked lots of questions all the time. We're asked about things that relate to human rights, right? And human rights have become a buzzword, right? Very important, you know, after 1948, as we'll come to know. The convention, the Human Rights Convention, 1948, with the 30 articles, have become almost like scripture. So questions like, you know, your religion is against human rights for X, Y, Z reason. And this kind of trajectory that we're introduced to, which assumes that we have to go from the primitive kind of state that we're in right now and follow through the European kind of progress trajectory that the Christians have already done, and we need to now follow the same kind of, you know, the same kind of course. And of course, there are a lot of presuppositions and assumptions with this, which we are going to discover. But the first thing we need to kind of talk about is what is referred to as the epistemological basis, okay, of liberalism. Now, this is a big word. What does this mean? Epistemology is how you get to know, making sense of the world. Making sense of the world. Basically, how do you know about the world, right? When we're talking about the epistemological basis of liberalism, in particular, we're talking about what grounds liberalism. What are the assumptions of liberalism? What are the first principles of liberalism? Now, what are first principles generally? You can break something down, like for example, this thing here, or a mobile phone, you can break it down to smaller constituent parts, okay? Everything is broken down to basic parts. Those are the first principles of the thing. So when we're talking about the first principles, we're asking, if we break liberalism down to the lowest common multiple, if you like, to its kind of basic building blocks, what are we left with? What is the foundation by which liberalism is built on? You can't build, you know, castles on thin air, can you? Right? I mean, I'm sure you guys know in Amsterdam you've got great infrastructure. You've got incredible engineers here, right? So it's about what are the foundations, you know, of liberalism? And so to know that, you have to look at the basic philosophy of liberalism. And if you look at that, you'll find that there are some themes which are consistent. And what are the themes that are consistent? Basically, if you look at the works of all the way from John Locke, who is, you could argue, the founding father of liberalism, a man called John Locke. You could say he's the founding father of liberalism, all the way down to John Rawls, who was probably the last major contributor of liberalism. You'll find that they believed in something called the hedonistic principle. Now, the hedonistic principle is simple, right? It's about pain and pleasure. It's as simple as that. They argued that morality should be premised, predicated, aligned with pain, the human propensity to pain and pleasure. And the idea was you should maximize as much pleasure as you can, and you should minimize as much pain as possible. This is the most desirable and moral way to live. This evolved, as we'll find out, into something called utilitarianism, which is literally the greatest good for the greatest number. The greatest good for the greatest number. So eventually this meant that we are trying to maximize pleasure for as many people as possible, and we are trying to also, by extension, minimize pain for as many people as possible. That's the model. That's point one. Number two is, you'll be quite surprised, is theology. Now, if you look at the work of, for example, John Locke, you'll find that he oftentimes makes reference to God. He says we are created equal, right? And remember, when he was writing his major book called The Two Treatises of Government, he was writing it to someone called Robert Filmer. And he was arguing using the Bible. So a lot of the things here, and this is an important point, and I want everyone to remember this, right? A lot of the assumptions of liberalism depend upon a theological backing. In other words, the fact that we were created equal. Listen to the terminology here. You're created equal. That's taken from John Locke. It was put into the Declaration of Independence. It was put into the constitutions of major countries like America and France. But it's taken from John Locke. He was a theist. He believed in God. Now the question is, now obviously in Europe, especially Western Europe, there's a rise in atheism. But you still find that atheist politicians use the same kind of terminology. We're equal. We're born equal. Now the question is, well, John Locke had God to premise that on. He had God to predicate that on. He had the Bible to go back on. But what do you have now as an atheist? How can you prove as an atheist, right, on naturalism, say, or something else, that you are born equal? In fact, on naturalism, we're not born equal. In fact, on naturalism, we're fundamentally unequal. Why? Because you've got someone like me, who's about 6'6". Yes. And someone else who might be much shorter. You have black people and white people. You have people who are born in different geographic places and have different kind of opportunities as a result. People who are born disabled, people who are born conjoined to a twin, people who are born in this way and that. Naturalistically, where is the equality here? In fact, one thing we can guarantee is inequality. Even with twins, you have different fingerprints. Everything on naturalism is unequal. For an atheist then to say, look, we're born equal, on what basis? Because actually John Locke was arguing using God before. So what are you arguing what are you basing this on? So, a straightforward question to an atheist liberal, how can you prove that we're born equal? How are you going to do that? In fact, evolution, the theory of Darwinian evolution, would tell us, and not just Darwinian evolution, any other kind of outgrowth of evolution, would tell us that actually we're not born equal. In fact, it's survival of the fittest. That we have no tendency to equality at all. In fact, we have a tendency to survival and reproduction. So on what basis are we born equal? You see, this discussion, which has now permeated the mass media and infiltrated almost every academic circle in the West, is predicated on something which has been dumped away in the dustbin of history, which is religion, for the most part. I mean, obviously, there's lots of Christian liberals who can justify this, or Jewish liberals who can say, well, actually, we still believe in equality. But then we go to the Bible and see what kind of equality does the Bible talk about. Seriously, that's what we're going to have to do now. How does the Bible define equality? That's the discussion now. And that was the discussion, by the way, that Robert Filmer and John Locke were having in the beginning. They were both making references to the story of Genesis and to the Bible and all these things. So what equality do you mean exactly? And that's important. Now, we talked about John Rawls. This was a guy who was, he's a very influential individual. And he's probably one of the individuals who people do their PhDs on now. He's one of the only individuals people still do their PhDs on in the liberal thought. He's probably the last one they do that on. He's like, in terms of contribution, his contribution was quite big, and he's probably the biggest, philosopher in the 20th century in Europe. And he argued for equality on a different kind of basis. We'll talk about how he argued for equality. But this is my claim, and I'll come back to it, and I want you to remember it. All liberal thinkers who argue on the basis of equality as a first principle either do so, number one, religiously, as we've seen with John Locke, or number two, with reference, and I'm going to use my terms blatantly here, with reference to a type of mythology. And you're going to say, what are you talking about? How can you substantiate that? Yes, there is such a thing as liberal myth. And we're going to uncover and unearth today what we mean by liberal myth. Because usually when, sorry to say, the white man, or let's say the Westerner, when they use the word myth in circles, or if you look at vernacularly in the dictionary, let's be honest, what do you have in your mind when I say myth? You have some Hindu god in your mind. You have Greek gods in your mind. That's what you have in your mind. Let's be honest, right? You might even have Genesis in your mind. You might even have Quranic images in your mind. Why? Because that is the Orientalist understanding of what a myth is. It's a story of some sorts, which is not substantiated in real history, isn't it? So to what extent is liberalism based on a story which is predicated on a real history? That's an important discussion. We'll come to it. So, individualism is another kind of thing which liberalism, not all of liberalism, but a large part of it kind of promotes. And this individualism is this: the idea that human beings know what's best for them. Okay? So, individualism, it literally comes from individual, right? That the individual knows what's best for him. If you abstract the individual, you take them out of their social circles and their community and their country and so on, that individual by themselves is better off knowing what's best for them. And obviously, even now, to be honest, to be fair, there's a new debate that's circling, which is individualism versus communitarianism. Now, communitarianism, you have people like Michael Sandel, who's right now one of the biggest scholars in probably the Western world, talking about liberalism. And he talks about communitarianism. He says, no. He says, human beings are not individual in that way. We're all interdependent. Communities are actually more effective than individuals in terms of social organization. So there's a big discussion now between individualism and communitarianism. It's a new debate. All right, so in terms of history, to get straight into the thick of it, the question is, when did liberalism kind of begin? So you could say liberalism began out of England. Now, I'm not saying that because I'm a British guy and I'm trying to enforce my, history on you. It came out, you could say, it was around this time, around the 1600s, which is about the 17th century. So the mid-17th century, when you had English Civil War. Now, the English Civil War was a long and drawn-out kind of war. You can look it up. I'm not going into that too much. Otherwise, I will feel like I'm back in school. And then you have something called the Bill of Rights. Now, the thing is now, here with the Bill of Rights, the all-important question was, to what extent should government's power be limited? And obviously, at this time, you had tensions between the monarchy and parliament. And we wanted to know what parliament, how much power should be given to the sovereign, which in this case is parliament. So John Locke, who died in 1706, actually contributed to this discourse massively. Because when he wrote his book, The Two Treatises of Government, this was incorporated into the Bill of Rights, which is a very important document in English law. Which was written in 1689. So a lot of his ideas, what would then become liberal ideas about, life, property, these important things that you have to be protected, the protectables, right? So, for example, life and property, etc., that would be incorporated into the Bill of Rights. So this was a turning point, you could say, in the history of liberalism. Now, John Locke died around 1706, which is the early 18th century. So in terms of liberalism and its development, you could argue that it became known really as a tradition in around the 18th century, which means it's quite a young tradition in the grand scheme of things. It's about 300 years old. So after that, you had obviously the US founding fathers and the documents that were associated with the beginning of the Republic of United States. And a lot of John Locke's ideas and other people's ideas were incorporated into those documents. So once again, liberalism started to become institutionalized, and slowly it's becoming the dominant ethic. Now don't forget, religion was very important at this time as well. But if you look at the rising importance of liberalism, you'll find that it coincided with the decline of enthusiasm about religion. So people were becoming more enthusiastic about liberalism, about an ideology which in and of itself you couldn't argue is Abrahamic, for example, in religious complexion. It was something different, and they were becoming less enthusiastic about Christianity. You had someone like Rousseau, who was a very important figure, and he died in 1778. Obviously, this is not an exhaustive list of, this is just a suggestive list to show you some key points of history. And we said that not only did the USA have an important impact, but France as well, because, as you guys know, France was founded on these kinds of ideas as well because of the revolution. You had the French Revolution, you had the American Revolution against the British, you had the French Revolution against the bourgeoisie, right, the elites, and so on. A very important philosopher in the history of liberalism is Immanuel Kant. You could argue, really, he was one of the most important philosophers. You could make this argument in Western history. You could make this argument. Maybe right after Aristotle or something. He's a very important figure, not only in liberal thought, but in all of Western thought. Immanuel Kant. And he gave some contributions as well. As you can see here, this is a time where it's kind of the Industrial Revolution. Things are starting to change here. Steam trains were being invented and so on. So he was at a time where there was technological developments and so on. Then you had John Stuart Mill, who was around in the Victorian era. This guy is important in liberalism and generally, because a lot of the dominant ethics that we have today, especially in social circles, are based on his ideas, by the way. And he was way, to use a colonial, post-colonial term, beyond his time, in the sense that he was for universal suffrage for both men and women, which we don't have a problem with as Muslims, by the way, just in case anyone tries to chuck something at me, right? But he was, the Prophet Mohammed, by the way, and Islam, they gave, the Muslims gave bay'ah, men and women gave bay'ah 1400 years ago. That's just an interesting kind of tangential point there. We're in the year, 2000, what are we now, 2018 or 19? I forget. No, I'm joking. So this was about 100 years ago that men and women can vote, right? 100 years ago, that's when, in the UK at least, in Canada it was 1917. But he was beyond his time in that perspective. He wrote a treatise on women and women's kind of universal suffrage and other kind of things. The most important thing that you could probably pluck out of his philosophy, which is very important, is the harm principle. And you'll find that this is the logic that almost everyone uses, to justify whatever moral they want to justify. And the harm principle, going back to our hedonistic principle now. The hedonistic principle was what? That you want to minimize pain and maximize what? Pleasure. Okay, so everyone's with me, yeah? So obviously this guy called Jeremy Bentham came along and said, but hold on. He said, yeah, we want to maximize the amount, as much pleasure as possible and as possible, generally, yeah? So you had scenarios like, a gang rape scenario. So if you have 10 men and 1 woman, and they all want to enjoy themselves, so they can all, exploit the woman. This was the issue with utilitarianism. So John Stuart Mill came along and said, there's a problem with utilitarianism, which is that it allows this kind of infringement of human rights. Or he didn't really refer to it as human rights, as we'll come to know, but on individual liberties. And so you can do whatever you want to do, so long as you don't harm anyone else. This is the harm principle. Let's say it one more time. You can do whatever you want to do, so long as you don't harm anyone else. So now, if you ask, it's a bit of a controversial topic, but if you ask, why is homosexuality, why should it be, or any kind of thing, right? Not just homosexuality, any non-normative sexual practice. Any non-normative sexual practice. Should it be allowed? So a liberal should answer, at least, so long as it doesn't harm anyone else, it should be allowed. Have you heard this? So obviously, those religious people who were arguing against, for example, homosexuality, were saying that it's not natural and all those kind of things, yeah? A liberal turns around and says, that's not the ethic that we're dealing with right now. The ethic that we're dealing with is that so long as it doesn't harm anyone else, you can't get involved. That's the ethic. Okay, if that's the ethic, my question would be, what about incest rights? That's my question, because it's not really something which is emphasized. Now, someone might argue that, hold on, deformed babies, you can have deformed baby coming out of that situation. I would say, hold on, what if a father and a son, there's no babies going to come out of that, actually. Or a brother and a brother. That's not something which liberals have actually, in my estimation at least, as a movement, has tried to guarantee the rights of, incest rights. Even though it goes along the same kind of principles as John Stuart Mill's harm principle, right? So there has been a kind of favoring of one kind of non-normative practice, in this case homosexuality, over other kinds of non-normative sexual practices, for example, incest, and so on. But the reason for that is just simply because homosexuals in the 60s and 70s, or those groups who represented them, had more of a chance and had more success in being able to mobilize social support for their cause. If there had been 1 million brothers coming out together with placards, incest rights, we love each other, seriously, would they be guaranteed the same rights? In many of the countries, which are liberal countries, this is illegal. This is illegal. Incest is illegal. But the question is, why is it illegal? It doesn't go against the harm principle. Say deformed babies, but what if they're using contraception? What if it's 2 brothers, brother and brother? There's no babies going to come out of that. Seriously. So there has been a double standard in the way even liberal principles have been manipulated in order to make cases. So I've had lots of conversations. You can maybe see them on YouTube. What I find problematic is the most consistent answer, by the way, some of them are just straightforward to say, you're right. If we're going to afford rights for one non-normative sexual practice, like homosexuality, we should afford it for all non-normative sexual practices so long as no harm is done. That's a consistent answer. I would say, you know what? At least you're consistent. But some homosexuals or other people who claim to represent their interests actually argued along naturalistic lines. They said, no, it's not natural for a brother and a brother to have sex. So why is it not? Who defines natural now? Because you just told off that Christian guy He told him off when he said, what you're doing is not natural. So what gives you the right to determine what's natural and not natural? So a secondary explanation could be, well, we're born gay. And this is something David Hume referred to as the ought-is problem. Just because you're born, let's just say for the sake of argument, I'm not going to go into the genetics, I'm not a geneticist. Let's say for the sake of argument, say you're born gay, no problem. But just because you are something, it doesn't mean you ought to be that thing. And there's no way that any philosopher has been able to solve this problem. David Hume himself, in his book Inquiry into Moral Ethics, he described the problem. He said, well, just because something is the case, it doesn't mean it ought to be the case. What if someone is born with an incestuous gene? Does it mean that they should be incestuous? What if someone is born with something more pernicious than that? Or, in our estimation, of course, you could argue morals are relative, frankly. I mean, who is to make the judgment? However, the point is, the ought-is distinction is always going to be a problem for someone who wants to say, we're born that way. So the problem is, when now we're asked, okay, in Islam, let's be honest. In Islam, why is homosexuality a sin? We say, wait, hold on. Why is that particular type of non-normative sexual practice permitted on your worldview? They say because the harm principle. So, okay, well, the harm principle should apply to two brothers having sex and two sisters having, if you want to call it sex, you can call it sex. Whatever it may be, right? Or even a brother and a sister, so long as some kind of contraception is used, and so on and so forth. But you're not using that. If they are using that, hats off to them. Well done. You're being morally consistent, and you're being in accordance with the harm principle. If you're not using that, and you're giving preferential treatment to one kind of non-normative sexual practice of another, frankly, it doesn't even make sense. So this is the last thing I'm going to quickly touch upon now. And we've kind of touched upon the idea of some of the questions we're asked as, let's say, traditionalists or, conventional, orthodox, whatever you want to call it, Muslims, right? Why this, why that? Well, the reason why they're asking that question, as we've just discovered, is because they have a dominant ethic, which frankly, for the most part, has not been consistently used in Western circles, is not predicated on anything which is objective. You can't put any of that stuff under a microscope. All of those morals, frankly, have not been verified. So they don't really have a reason to ask us any of those questions in the first place. Now when we talk about this thing, human rights, because now this is almost the Trump card. If you want to knock out, not Trump, Donald Trump, if you want to knock out a Muslim, ask them about human rights. Ask them about freedom of expression and speech. What's the ruling on blasphemy laws? What's the ruling, and we'll talk about this in detail in the next section, on apostasy law. And I'm going to bring this up as the case study. Ridda. What happens in an Islamic state? Yes, what happens? Is there a death penalty there? We'll come to it. It's a bit of a suspense. We'll talk about it in the next session. But isn't that against human rights? Let's say for the sake of argument, yes, it's against human rights. All of the things that you mentioned and other things, anything, yes, it's against human rights. But let's go back. What is human rights an outgrowth of? Human rights is an outgrowth of this shaky, destabilized liberalism, which frankly has not been substantiated in the first instance. So there's a problem there. So in history, we're going to talk about quickly, first of all, this word human rights, it was not referred to as human rights until quite recently. It was referred to usually as natural rights. So even when people like Jeremy Bentham was attacking it, he called it nonsense on stilts. Because what natural rights? How can you prove it? Jeremy Bentham, the one who talked about utilitarianism, the one who actually taught, the teacher of John Stuart Mill, and the one he inspired him in many ways. He called it nonsense on stilts. But we'll come to that. This is an interesting thing. There's the last slide for today, for this session, and then we'll come back and talk about the other things. This is an interesting thing. It's called Google Ngram. You can use it to see how much a word has been used in literature. And if you can see here, the word human rights itself only started to become popular around 1948. And obviously that's when it was written, the Convention of Human Rights. But before that, this term human rights wasn't even in the common vernacular of either the academics or the non-academics. So all of a sudden after World War II, this thing that you guys made up, frankly, called human rights, which we're going to talk about, right? We are going to talk about human rights. This thing you guys made up called human rights, which you insisted is universal without any proof, is now being used to colonize. It's being used to spread liberalism by the sword. And that's the irony of it all. So the question is, to what extent are human rights compatible with traditionalist Islam? We're going to look at a case study, and we're going to be very straightforward today, guys. After the break, we're going to look at some of the most controversial case studies you can think about, the most controversial questions. Those which I was talking about, which reference the punitive law of Islam, those which reference, for example, the had, the hudud, the punishments in Islam. And we are going to do a thorough comparison, inshallah, between liberalism and traditionalist Islam. And what we're going to uncover and unearth, in my opinion, is going to be something which will put things in perspective. So I'll let you guys have the break now, because the time is up, and we'll see you after the break. Okay. All right, good. So this is going to be the last part of the monologue, if you like, and then after that, we're going to try and create more interactivity, because it is important that we engage with one another. You might have lots of questions, I'm sure you do. And so just to kind of carry on from where we pick up from where we left off, we talked about human rights as not being a term that was commonly employed throughout the centuries, frankly, right? It wasn't really a term which goes all the way back to liberalism or all the way back to, for example, the ancient Greeks or something like that. Instead, it's a term which became very popular after 1948. That's not to say it didn't exist before 1948. It did exist, but it just became much more popular because, as you know, the UN, which is an organization which is pretty much steered by the United States of America and other allies, took control of the UN, and obviously they had the convention, and after that convention was put forward, it became part of the media, became part of academia and so on. But taking a step back now, the question is, because I mentioned and alluded to this in the beginning of this lecture, we talked about some of the mythologies that liberalism is predicated on. What did I mean when I say liberalism is predicated on mythology? Now, what I meant was this: the state of nature. The state of nature is a very important part of liberalism. And it's mentioned by many different scholars and thinkers like John Locke, like Thomas Hobbes, like Rousseau and others. And for instance, Thomas Hobbes talks about this hypothetical state before human beings were contracted to the state. So let's take a contemporary example. We live in the West, for example. You guys live in Holland. I live in the UK. I'm born into, that state. You guys, many of you, except for the illegal immigrants, I'm sure, which is the majority, no? We're born here, right? So you come, or you're born here, or you decide to come over through ship or through whatever you guys did, right? Yes? You decide to come over here, and when you come over here, what are you obliged by? The law, the universal law. In other words, you have to obey the law of the land. It's a straightforward thing. But the question is, who gave the government the power in the first place? Who gave government the power in the first place? So liberal theory would suggest that there was a state of nature. There was a primordial, if you like, state of nature. and then we contracted to a sovereign or a representative or a power. Now, when did this take place? When did this thing take place where there was man against man, where it was a brutish, poor and short thing? It never actually historically took place at all. This is a fake history. And it was made, this is mythology, this story, this fiction, frankly, this was made up. It wasn't a scientific investigation that was done. It wasn't historical records that were retrieved. It was simply a story, a bedtime story, a fairy tale. Seriously, I mean, this is what it's predicated on. Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and others, they talked about a time, maybe a prehistoric time or a pre-government time, where people were fighting each other, and so they needed to give up some of their rights in order to allow the sovereign master to come and protect them. And all of the subsequent generations of people would be subsequently contracted to that government, even if they didn't consent to it. Because we, living in a country, we didn't say we consent to there being a government. We consent to there being, a representative that's going to make law on our behalf. Sometimes you have voting, yes, but it's not. We didn't even consent to the system of government. So how do we justify, from a liberal perspective, that there is a government? It's this idea, which we're going to come onto, of social contract. But the primordial state is a story. It's a bedtime fiction. It's fake. It really is fake. Now, the story is different depending on which philosopher talks about it. So, for example, Kant, he says, all mankind, who will but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, liberty, or possessions. So in the primordial state for Locke, he envisaged that there were some rights that ought to be protected in the first instance. Hobbes saw it more about man against man, but both made up the story that there was a time, or there ought to have been a time, there's this hypothetical, metaphysical, mythological, fictitious thing that happened where we were all, human beings were all like in the jungle, if you like, of life, and we were all fighting each other, and we needed some leader to come that we could consult with or contract with in order to stop the chaos and the anarchy. That's the story. So humans initially have of liberty, Locke would argue, and property. Hobbes would disagree with him, but both would made up the story. It's a fake story. Now, the social contract was required now. And the social contract, we've already mentioned, is this contract that human beings took when they were in the state of fighting each other, in the state of nature. They took this contract with the sovereign, some kind of leader. Maybe the sovereign had power, military power. Maybe they were able to grant protection. Wherever it may be, there was a contract. SubhanAllah, this is actually quite similar to Islamic theology, because we also believe in a contract as well. You know that? And it's in the Quran. But we believe our contract was with Allah. So we were contracted with Allah. They believe we were contracted with an imaginary fake figure. In fact, the book that Hobbes talked about is called The Leviathan. It's called The Leviathan. What is the Leviathan? It's a monster. It's a monster creature. It's a fake creature, like something sci-fi, like a sci-fi image. Tell me if this is not mythology. Why is it not mythology? Is it because the white man wrote it down? Be honest with yourselves. Seriously, is it because it's secular? It's pure mythology. And there's nothing to justify it whatsoever. But as Muslims, we believe in a contract, right, with Allah, where Allah says in the Quran, with أَخَذَ اللَّهُ مِيثَاقَ بَنِي آدَمَ. Allah took the mithaq, the contract with Adam, with the children of Adam. وَأَخَذْ مِنْ ذُرِّيَّتِهُمْ, and he took from their مِنْ ظُهُورِهِمْ ذُرِّيَّةً. He took from their back, and he said, أَلَسْتُ بِرَبِّكُمْ? He said, am I not your Lord and your master? قَالُوا بَلَا شَهِدْنَا. We said yes. So for us as Muslims, we were contracted to Allah. For the liberal, we were contracted to some imaginary figure which didn't really exist, even according to them. If you ask any liberal today, do you believe in this thing? No, we don't believe it. So they have a mythology as well. We don't have a mythology. We would say we can justify the existence of God from first principles, which is a different conversation for a different time. All right, so what are the entailments of social contract? And this is a key point here in the discussion, because we talked about human rights. And some of the questions we're asked as Muslims relate to fundamental human rights. So for example, equality of men and women. This is, by the way, according to what strand of feminism? Second wave feminism, third wave feminism, first wave feminism even. What do we mean by equality? According to whose feminism? Is it the Eurocentric understanding of feminism? Is it an African feminism? Is it a Middle Eastern feminism? That's a different discussion. But they say also that we have to have freedom of expression of whatever religious belief you want. To what extent though? Because obviously, society, even in this country and other countries, has decided that there are certain kinds of things which can't exist, which jeopardize security and so on. So the question is, when now we've come out of the state of nature, from a liberal perspective, we've come out of the state of nature, and we're socially contracted to this representative, which in modern parlance would be referred to as government, right? When we're now we're tied to such representative, the question is, what are the things this representative can do on our behalf? This is a key thing, and I want everyone to remember this, right? This is something which Immanuel Kant, which we said already, was one of the biggest philosophers in all of liberal history, but not only that, but one of the biggest philosophy of all Western history. He basically says, and I'm not going to read this whole thing, you can kind of read it yourself. He basically says that if the supreme sovereign, this socially contracted thing, or body or government or whatever it is, that has pretty much ultimate authority. Even if he decides to kill you, or kill some people, or jail some people, or hurt some people. There's a hadith in Sahih Muslim that says, وَلَوْ جَلَدَ ظَهْرَكَ وَأَخَذَ مَالَكَ, which some people make fun of. That, you've got to be obedient to the leader, even if he whips your back or takes your money. Obviously, there's such a big discussion on this. We're not having that discussion, but this is the same kind of thing in liberal theory. So in liberal theory, it's conceivable that there is a law which so limits human freedoms so as to allow someone to be killed as a result. And John Locke says in one of his books, I think it's the Two Treatises of Government, he says, if someone is commanded to stand in the face of a cannon, if a soldier is commanded to stand in the face of a cannon, yes, in other words, a blowing cannon, he should do it. And it's not illiberal for someone to do that, which is kind of like suicide bombing, by the way. Think about that. No, seriously, what is that? Tell me what that is. Standing in the face of a cannon is destroying yourself. It's killing yourself, suicide. So according to John Locke, and by the way, also according to John Rawls, who says that you can kill innocents. By the way, this is what he says. He says you can kill innocents in war, just war. You can target the innocent, not collateral damage. No, you can target them. So you can not only be subject to a suicide type scenario, according to John Locke, but all the way through to John Rawls, who said, you not only can be subject to such scenario, but you can subject others to such scenario as well. In other words, you can kill children. If it goes back to the social contract, and if it goes back to the mandated, legitimate, sovereign leader who we have been socially contracted to in this mythological state of nature. Bearing that in mind, the question now is, what's the relevance of this and apostasy? Well, the liberal would ask, what is this thing that you guys have in your old books of fiqh, of jurisprudence. And I said in the beginning of the lecture that when I describe, I'll be defining what Islamic traditionalism is. So I'll do it quickly now. Islamic traditionalism to me is a jurisprudential understanding of Islam, for example, through the 4 schools of thought in Sunni Islam. For example, right? So that's my understanding of Islamic traditionalism. So obviously, if you open a book of Islamic law, which is like a classical book, and you go to maybe the, Kitab al-Jinayat or something like that, you might see this Haddur Ridda, the punishment of apostasy. And you'll see that some of those scholars will say, the one who changes his religion, they should be killed in an Islamic state. And you think, wait a minute, doesn't this strongly oppose human rights? And on the face of it, it does strongly oppose human rights. And this is not, on the face of it, prima facie, what we believe in anyway. This is a decontextualized understanding of Islamic law, and I'll explain that in a second. But what's interesting is this: so long as something is justified through a social contract on liberalism, look what John Locke is saying. John Locke, who is the founding father of liberalism, says that there can be an apostasy law. Wait a minute. What does he say? He says, the first is those of who? Being initiated in the Mosaic rites. He's talking about the Jewish states or Jewish states. And made citizens of that commonwealth, did afterwards apostatize, means become murtad, from the worship of the God of Israel. These were proceeded against as traitors and rebels, guilty of no less than high treason. Listen to this. No less than high treason. For the commonwealth of the Jews, different in that from all others, was an absolute theocracy, nor was there, or could there be, any difference between that and the commonwealth of the church. Now, what does this mean? What's he trying to say? He's saying because the state of the Jews is predicated on your contracting with God and your being Jewish in the first instance, that it's justifiable on liberalism. Listen to this carefully. It's justifiable on liberalism. From this social contract understanding, that if someone publicly says, I'm not a Jew anymore, for the state to say, come here, we're going to execute you. Now, is that what the Quran says? The Quran doesn't make this kind of articulation, by the way. This is what John Locke says, who is the founding father of liberalism. So how conceivable is it on liberalism that these laws can be put in place? It is fully conceivable in principle. Now, one could argue that was John Locke, that was 300 years ago. We're no longer looking at Locke. My argument is not about John Locke. He is looking at the conceivability through the principles of liberalism. I am saying because the principles of liberalism through social contract allow such possibilities, you cannot argue that liberalism is against a public apostasy law which would entail a death of a person. You cannot argue that. It's impossible to argue that. You could argue as a liberal, I'm not really, in tune with that, and I think it ought not to be. But if a country decides, for example, that this country is not a secular country, not this country, obviously it is, but we're talking about a country like, a Jewish state, not talking about Israel, that's a different discussion. But if it decides, okay, our social contract is not a secular one, it's a theocracy of some sorts, let's say, for the sake of argument, or it's something which is predicated on religious scriptures. If that's the case, the question is, how illiberal is it on social contractarianism to have such law? John Locke answers, in fact, this is not illiberal at all. And not only would John Locke say that, Immanuel Kant would say that. I've seen manuscripts of John Stuart Mill saying that. It's quite consistent. So, the question now is, what does Islam have to say about that? But before I go into that question about apostasy in Islam, there's an argument I want to make. And the main argument is articulated here. This is part of my book. I've actually written a book here. It's coming out maybe end of the year. Yes, I've been doing the research. And by the way, this is not something I just whipped up. I've spoken to a lot of academics about this. All right, my main argument, liberalism or liberalization efforts are epistemologically fruitless if they are predicated on the assumption that such liberalization necessarily entails more freedom from government interventionism in cases which relate to administration of the death penalty for non-allegiance to a state. Now, it's a very long-winded statement, but you have to be careful with academics. What I'm saying is, there is something similar between, for example, that which is referred to as the haddur ridda, which is what is referred to as the punishment for apostasy, and treason. And the common denominator is non-allegiance to a state. So, for example, if you look at the American Constitution, if my memory serves me correctly, I think Article 3 talks about the treason. It's a clause on treason, a treason clause. And basically what it says is if you show non-allegiance, different states have different rules. In America, it could be punishable and has been punishable by death. And by the way, what's interesting is, as a side note, in terms of actual case study examples, you'll find that America has conducted many extrajudicial killings outside of, obviously, the parameters of the judiciary. As you know, for example, many of you may have heard of Anwar al-Awlaqi. Yes? His son was killed. His name is Abdurrahman al-Awlaqi. And his daughter was also killed. They were kids, by the way. They were killed by a drone attack on them. Yes? They were killed by a drone attack on them. Why? Because the American government were afraid because, okay, their father is a radical. The child will also grow up to be a radical, right? So they literally sent little drones to kill the kids. Now, those kids didn't deserve to be killed. And moreover, they didn't even stand trial, if that was possible for a child to stand trial at the age of 6 years old or whatever it may have been anyway. So the question of extrajudicial killing is something completely different anyway. I'm talking about when the treason law itself has been implemented. And what's interesting, if you look at constitutional law in America, is that those defendants who are subject to such encroachments from the military establishment in America actually try and get the treason law to be enacted on them. In other words, a lot of them argue that we want to be tried in accordance with the treason law because they know they have more chance of being not killed, for example, in that case. But there have been those extrajudicial killings. Now, that's something else. The point is this. It is conceivable principally that a government, because it deems you as non-ally now, you're no longer a citizen, depriving you of your citizenship and so on, they can make a subsequent decision to kill you. And it has been done, but it's just been named something else. This is the point. Now, the truth is this. In Islam, you have to first ask what is apostasy and what is treason, right? Now, who gets to define treason? Now, someone might argue treason is this, and they'll go online and, this pseudo-intellectual approach. Oh, treason means this. Listen, spare your white man definitions, keep them to yourself. Seriously, who wrote the dictionary? Who was it? Was it someone who we all agreed this is the authority? Yes, let him be the one? No, come on, let's be honest. Oxford Dictionary, Webster Dictionary. No, it wasn't something which we all, as humankind, decided, yes, this is... No. Vernacular definitions from the dictionary are fruitless to me. You can't use a secular definition, impose it on a religious framework, and try and explain things that way. Treason is defined differently, yes, because you have a secular framework versus a religious one. Why should you impose a secular framework on a religious one As much as why would you impose a religious one on a secular one? They both have two different standards, right? However, the principle of non-allegiance is the same. So in other words, really and truly, what is the common denominator? When a state deems that you're no longer allied. Now here's the point. Is it to do with what you believe? Now I would put to you, submit to everyone here today, that it's not to do with what you believe. And the evidence is not لا إكراه في الدين قد تبين الرشد من الغي, that there's no compulsion in religion. There is that. That's for the non-Muslims. By the way, that verse by ijma' is for the non-Muslims. There's no compulsion in religion. Chapter 2, verse 256 means you can't force a non-Muslim to become Muslim. But what about ما كان لمؤمن ولا مؤمنة إذا قضى الله ورسوله أمرا أن يكون لهم الخيرة من أمرهم. Sorry, I've recited that quickly, but in Surah Al-Ahzab, where it says it's not for a man or a woman who's a Muslim or a mu'min that when Allah and His Messenger decide something that they have any choice in the matter. The point is this, even then, it's not to do with belief. And it's conceivable and possible for someone to lose faith in their religion. As a Muslim in an Islamic government state, or whatever you want to call it, I'm not talking about those things which exist, but it's conceivable and they would have no repercussion whatsoever. It's not to do, and what's the evidence for that? Two pieces of evidence. One of them is the list of Hudayfa. Hudayfa ibn Yaman had a list of people who are munafiqun. What's a munafiq? A munafiq is someone who does not believe really in Islam. He does not believe in Islam. That's the true understanding of munafiq. Yes, he might walk around in society and not necessarily publicate that he's left Islam, but he does not believe in Islam. That list, even though Muslims were aware that those people were not Muslims, they didn't kill those individuals because there was no rupture of a social contract there. In other words, it's conceivable now, if someone in the West becomes non-Muslim and they were Muslim, we're not going to say go and kill that individual. No way. This is an understanding of Islam which is Orientalist, decontextualized and completely wrong in my opinion. There's no way you can do that. Because there was no contract between you and that person that, okay, you are now allied to that state in that way. There's no state. In fact, the state here says you can do whatever you want and you can have whatever belief you want. So in fact, their contract is different to your contract. The Quran says, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, awfu bil uqud. Those, O you who believe, fulfill the contract. So in other words, there is no contract there. There has to be a contract. You have to be under an Islamic state, and you have to have agreed to the terms. If those conditions are not met, then we can't say there's going to be any ramification. Now, another point is this, is that you have, and this is one of the final points I'm going to make, is that you have another example, and this is one of the biggest ahadith in Sahih Bukhari. It's in Kitab al-Shurut, the book of conditions. And then you have a discussion between Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and the Quraysh. And the Quraysh were saying, listen to this carefully, if your people in your state become non-Muslim, bring them back to us. Do you agree to those terms? And he agreed to those terms. Say that one more time. He said, if people in your state become non-Muslim, under this contract that we have now, bring those guys who have left Islam, apostated, back to us. He said, no problem. He agreed to those conditions. Meaning what this means is that it's totally conceivable, both on Islam and liberalism, for there to be some kind of social contract which would bind somebody to a state of being. Now, even if they decide to change their religion, it's conceivable on both liberalism and Islam that it's not a problem. And it's conceivable on both liberalism and Islam that it could have ramifications depending upon how it's perceived by the state. Now, next. The reason why the topic today was referred to as liberalism as religion, and this is a really interesting quote. I'm going to read it out. It says, theories of modernization are not scientific hypotheses, but theodicies, narratives of providence and redemption presented in the jargon of social science. What we're saying is that liberalism, the reason why it's been able to have this perceived epistemological upper hand on the religious narrative, not just the Islamic one, is because it seems like you're speaking scientifically when you're talking about secular ideology. What we've been able to show today, ladies and gentlemen, is that that is not the case, and that the first principles of liberalism are unfounded, unsubstantiated, unproven. We've also been able to show, ladies and gentlemen, that actually not only are the first principles unproven, but a lot of them are based on mythology, fiction, stories, and so on. And so to favor that kind of a narrative over and above the Islamic one, or any other religious narrative for that matter, is frankly, academically unfair in the first instance, epistemologically unjustified in the first instance, philosophically unjust, frankly. You can't do that and ask us questions. So before any questions are asked from a person who claims to be a liberal, who might be now thinking that they have found the ultimate truth, how can you prove liberalism is an objective moral standard, number one, from a scientific perspective or otherwise, or from a rational first principle perspective? Number two, why do you expect us to believe in your myth? Why? Even your philosophers that propounded that myth didn't believe in it fully themselves. They didn't conduct any scientific experiments. Number three, do you not realize that it's as conceivable on a contractarian understanding of liberalism to have as much punitive law as could conceivably be the case in an Islamic state with all of the punitive laws being implemented? So if that is the case, what do you have to offer us? What is modernization? Why should we be like you? What have you got for us? The answer is, really, you have nothing for us. Sorry to say, and to be blunt, you have nothing to offer. Liberalism has nothing to offer Islam. That's the answer. Liberalism has nothing to offer Islam. There's nothing there for us. Everything that's conceivable in liberalism can also be potentially conceivable in Islam, and vice versa, in terms of punitive laws and so on. So what's the issue? Now they'll say human rights. Human rights, and I'm going to say this once and everyone should remember it. Human rights is a metaphysical construct which cannot be actualized in the real world. It's impossible to have an actualization of human rights with the existence of social contracts. You can never have ultimate freedom of anything. That's nonsense on stilts, as Jeremy Bentham said. It's impossible. Now, the answer is this, that liberals will say, we define the extent to which freedom of speech, expression, and so on, thought and religion should be exercised in a state in accordance with democracy, or this, or that, or the other. But those things themselves are problematic because they, number one, could be in conflict with liberalism, and number two, could bring out results like Hitler, which, retrospectively, everyone looks back and says, how immoral was he? In sum, therefore, what I want to say is, the question needs to be questioned. Whenever they ask you a question which is predicated on human rights, you should say, no, thank you. You have to first justify yourself. The last thing here I've got, sorry, is it okay for me to go over a little bit? Okay. There is an Orientalism here. By the way, Orientalism is not just a book that Edward Said wrote, which places the East as the subject of investigation, the abject, the other, but it's a kind of Orientalism which actually also exists in liberal discourse. So what many liberal Orientalists and progressive Muslims groups attempt to do is demonstrate the extent to which the hudud or punitive laws referred to in the traditionalist discourse are totally aberrational and therefore unacceptable in the context of human rights and liberalism in particular. From this adduction, Muslim minorities in the West who have no intention of bringing to life such abstract rulings are further abject to social imagination of large swathes of the majority of populace. In other words, really and truly, all of those punitive laws of Islam have nothing to do with the Muslim minority existence in the West. We have no intention whatsoever of implementing any of the punitive laws in the Western world. But those laws are used as an ammunition against a minority, which produces an irony, frankly. The irony is, use those things to instill fear in the majority in order for you to juxtapose yourself or define yourself against the Muslim minority. And that is, frankly, a tyranny of the majority type logic, which liberalism itself came to dismiss. Irony. It's an irony. Almost all liberal thinkers talked about tyranny of the majority. Now you have this guy, what's his name? Geertz. What's his first name again? I don't care about his name, Wilder. Whatever his name. He's talking about a tax for women wearing a headscarf and this. This is against liberalism because it is, frankly, it doesn't understand that when you have a law in a liberal state, it has to be consistent to all people. He's not even liberal. His party is called the Freedom Party. You should take this ammunition, and it's not physical ammunition. No, take it's intellectual bullets and shoot this guy and others. Not physically. Not physically. Intellectually. Where should I aim? So I'll end with that. Okay. Jazakumullah khairan. We'll open up for questions and answers.
Say, give me this thing. Yes, now you can stay on